Okay, today we're going to take a look at a demo of Angular elements, and I'm going to try to present an almost simplest thing you could try to get it to work. And so I'm going to go through this project I created with Angular CLI, Angular 6, and we're going to demonstrate how you can create an element. Okay, so this is the application that we're going to attempt to do. And it's a simple application, and just to let you know, the Angular Elements has to be used within an Angular project at this point in time. So the first thing I thought of was, there's a couple of ways you could apply Angular Elements. Probably the best way is within your Angular application, do the content management thing, the content projection, like Google's documentation. That is a good application for using elements within your application, and that will basically give you content that a non-technical person can manage, where you have these Angular elements involved, which are kind of like widgets and do functionality that are designed and developed using Angular technology. But we're going to do something a little bit simpler. Okay, so my interest here is single page application, and I want to develop an element, and I also know that I have to work within an Angular application context. So basically what I'm doing is I'm first creating a single page application, and the single page application has an app root, which is this burgundy color, and I also have a child component. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at that UI component tree, take a look at the host elements. We're going to log the host elements, things like that. Trying to understand the differences between an Angular UI component tree or root component versus an Angular element. Okay. Then what I do is I create a module, and I'm designing an Angular element. It's an Angular component template in a separate module, and as the module bootstraps, what I do is I create a custom element using the Angular Elements package. I register it with the browser, and then what I do is I define some inputs and outputs of that component so that I could attempt to use some of the DOM API characteristics and use it like a standalone element. Okay, so basically what I'm doing down here is I'm creating a custom element, and basically I'm going to use dynamic binding and some features within Angular, the change detection, dynamic binding, and it's going to be a standalone element served by a standalone module. I called it a button module. I called it a button component, and inside that I used a button, and so. And I do several different things in index.html to show you that this is not part of the UI component tree. It is a part of a custom element that I developed, and I will show you some difference between the Angular app root for the UI component tree in the purple versus the Angular element, which I have here. So basically, the functionality is going to be this. I do have a component. It has a click count attribute, and I'm going to render it again just to show you. I have an AO-button custom element that I developed, and what I do is I pass an attribute, which is the label of this button. So when you first see this thing rendered, it has a default label. I pass that as input into my component. And then I set an interval where I actually changed the label inside my component. So my component is working. And then what I'm going to do is I add an event listener to this button. And in my component template, I emit the click count. And what the event handler does in the index.html is it gets a handle on that, and it displays it over here. Now this is a change detection, because when I click on this thing, the action that I'm emitting is 1, and and basically the state of the click count did not change until I finish my function, which has increased that count. So now I do OK, and the click count changed to be 1. So this is dynamic binding. But the event handler got the value of the click count after it was changed. And what I do is I take a span element in the index.html, and I insert inner HTML into that, saying the action value emitted from element, that is the click count, is 1. So I've used several different characteristics of an Angular element, and I'm getting my change detection, and I'm getting my dynamic binding. And of course, this is not a very useful component, but it's the simplest thing I could think of. So keep in mind, I could fire up an Angular application. I could have little dashboards, a dashboard of elements here, little markup fragments which show stock prices and things like that. And the bottom line is I'd be using Angular elements. And of course, usually when I write a single page application, usually it's very large. I have a header, a footer, a centerpiece, and I go all out with a single page application. But it always bothered me that once you move away from the app, you come in, you got this single page application life cycle, and there's a lot of things that are difficult with a single page application. The bright side of a single page application is I get change detection and dynamic binding here, and asynchronous. I could change different pieces in the markup here, and as well as here, because this is an Angular element. Now, what's not clear here is this Angular application has full Angular infrastructure. This might have, well, in the future, it should have its own mini infrastructure for Angular. I haven't really thought about right now what's going on behind the scenes here, but my ng module, my button module, should be able to be used independently, and I in the future I will not need a single page application, and I won't, I'd be able to use this any way I want. And like I said, keep in mind I could have created several different Angular elements here and just shown them underneath this real estate. So let's take a look at the application, and I'll try to keep things as simple as possible. So let's go to View, and I think I'll enter presentation mode to keep things. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is the fact that I've got this index.html, and I have my root component. And that's my UI component tree. That's typically the way you build an Angular application. You have a root component, there's a UI component tree there, and there's communication between the templates and the components, and there's sharing of data different ways, and it's really a large-scale application, and you typically put it on a single page, and you get the whole functionality of your application through that page. Now what I've done is I've created a Angular element, a custom element in HTML, which takes a label input and sets the button text to that label input. And also that AO-button element is, what I'm going to say, adheres to the DOM API, but what I'm saying, it's the host for my component template, and we use inputs and output annotations in our component to actually support the DOM API that I'm trying to provide. So right now, the DOM API I'm trying to provide is there's an input label, and there's some output. I add an event listener called action, and the button, which is this AO-button element, I added an event listener which it listens for an action event. So I emit this action in my component, and when I do, I actually get the event detail, and that's my click counter. So I have this script here that says get the AO button, add an event lister, call action when you get it, log in the console, do an alert action for the click count, And then what I do is I also get a span element from the document, and I insert, do an inner HTML, and I define the inner HTML to be action value emitted from the element. Click count is equal to, and basically I have that event detail, which is that click count. Now I have a set timeout here, and what I do is I define the button label. I'm seeing a button label. 5 seconds later to be click me again. And so I'm just testing the waters in several different areas here. Now that is my first attempt in trying to use an Angular element. My interest is, can I use this outside the single page application? And I think I've proven to myself I can. It's its own app module. And at the same time I could put it outside of the single page application. And in the future, I won't need the single page application. The do bootstrap function of the custom element will get fired, and it would bootstrap itself. But right now, that's not really happening. But I'll just show you a little bit about the app. Okay, so I do have the app component, and I have the button component and the child component. So first, let me show you that the main app module, which supports my UI component tree and my Angular application module, does not include the button component. It imports the button module, and upon importing this button module, that's the thing that instantiates my module, and in some sense is doing the bootstrap. But so I have an interface there for the button component, which has a do bootstrap in it. And I'm creating an element inside that component using the Angular Elements API, and I register it with the browser, and all is nice. But this is the simplest thing I could think of to try my custom element, is just use it within my application by just importing the module and having that thing fire up. So now I don't have to, I mean, I could show you a little bit about what the component is made out of, but the truth of the matter is it's just showing, it just shows my child component, and of course my app component is the AO root component, and I'm doing some stuff here. I'm just like injecting the element reference here so I could see what the host element is, and so the bottom line is the AO-root is the host element of the root component of the UI component tree, and when you look at the HTML of that, the AO child is the host component for the child component. Okay, but there's one big difference. Okay. So the child is like I said, it's no big deal. It's just got a template. It's got something very similar. I'm just logging the native element associated with my child component, and it's not a big deal. Okay, so basically the goal was to show you how to build a custom element using Angular, and to convince myself that I might know what I'm doing here. Okay, so the button component. Basically what I did was I created a module, then I created a component inside the same directory. And basically, my button module has a button component, and I import the Angular elements create custom element. I declare my button component. I also have to list it as a button, as an entry component, because that tells Angular that when this module is booted up, I want you to compile that component. It is not part of the UI component tree. It is not a child of the root component. It is its standalone thing. I need it transpiled. I need it compiled. I need it available when it's getting instantiated. Okay, so. And you've seen that typically in using like material design, when it's not part of the component tree, it's a pop-up dialog box. You got to list it as an entry component. You see it in Ionic quite a bit. All the web components have to be defined as entry components. And once again, my constructor needs the injector, and I'm assuming that's the app module injector. It should be the platform injector, and basically what I do inside the constructor is I use the create custom element. This is the Angular, the API to Angular elements, and I create a custom element. What this does is it takes my button component and it does whatever it needs to do, wrapping it so it supports the DOM API, whatever it may be, and is an injector that it needs in order to register that with the browser. And here's how you register the custom component. You use this custom elements function, which is part of the browser, and you define the AO-button, and you define it to be your custom element. Okay, so this is the name of it. This is the button component. This is the element component, right? So this is registering it with the browser so that this will be recognized, by the browser as a custom element, and you can call it a web component, and it's going to have its own standalone functionality. It's going to have a JavaScript object backing it, and it's going to be dynamic binding, change detection that's supported by Angular. Okay, so the magic comes here in the component itself. What we do is we have to import certain things. I mean, the view encapsulation mode we're using is native, which is supported in Google and Safari, etc. And I have typical things you're used to, the input and the output, and as an event emitter, everything's coming from Angular Core. And basically what I do is in my button class, I have an input, which is the label. I have an output, which is the action. And this is going to event, the event emitter is going to emit a number. So it's the click count, right? So, I mean, this isn't a perfect component, but the bottom line is I'm trying to experiment here and try to figure out what works, what doesn't, how simple is this, and how could I use this thing. And so what I tried is this example initially. And once again in the constructor, I inject the element reference so I could see what the a native element is and what the host element is. Now, it's native mode. We're using Shadow DOM, and there's a lot of things that are very confusing when you inspect the code, especially over the year as we were changing different Angular. So I'm not going to get too caught up in that. But I want to show you the event. So I have a handle click function here. So when I click the button that's part of my template, what I do is I increase the click count, and then I emit the click count. I also log. In my template, I don't even believe I'm using this anymore. Let's go look at the template real quick. The template is surrounded with a div, and I say this is the custom element button, and I click, and there's a handle click. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at, I'm going to do the change detection by doing the handle click and increasing the count, and then showing that with the interpolation operator here on the template. So you have the binding of data from the component to the template. You have the action from the button to the method in the component. And once again, you got this label here. Now, the magical thing about the label here is this button took this AO hyphen button component that I that I have supports this this template, and there's a label here which is being used as the input of the AO button. Okay, let's take a look at that real quick. The index has a label which is the input to the component. The component is getting that input and it's setting the label. And so the label in the HTML gets bound by this interpolation operator. So you'll see that label here. So this initially shows up as default label. And if I go and remove this from the index, this label equals, what'll happen is it'll show my default value here, click me instead. So we'll take a look at both of those things. As a matter of fact, yeah, we'll take a look at both of those things. But let me continue. Okay, so now, upon click, I told you I emit the event, and so in this particular template, there's certain things are happening. I'm rendering, I do dynamic binding and change detection, and so I see all that's working. And now if I look at the index.html, there's some other stuff here which is important. Okay, so first of all, the AO-button is my HTML. It has a button inside of it, but it also is sending some input, which is a default label, and it's also the component itself is emitting event, which is called action. And I add this event listener to the button, which is the AO-button element, the custom element, and basically I log and I alert, and then when I get the event detail, which is the click count, I actually query the span element and I set the inner HTML to that. So I think it's a good example to start with. My goal was to, and I think there's really good applications to using this right now. Not as good as some of the content projection and stuff, but still something I'm going to consider. Hopefully by the time I get anything done with this, maybe there'll be a full-blown version of the Angular elements that would work bootstrap independently. Okay, so that's the other thing I guess I should show you. The button module itself did have this ng do bootstrap function, and that's needed in the module. So my exported class, the button module, needed the injector, it needed the bootstrap, and it needed to create the custom element and define and register the element with the browser. So it's a pretty simple module, and really the functionality really gets provided by the button component and its template and its style sheet, of course. Okay. So I do some styling here with different colors, and I try a couple of things if I want to. So let's go back to the example, and let's go back to the example and take a look at it. Okay, so we're going to go through it again. This is this UI component tree that gets instantiated and rendered, and I'm styling it, and I'm just looking at certain things. And this is the button, this is the index.html, the sky blue. And this is, I think this is goldenrod or linen or whatever this color is. This is my AO-button custom element. And it goes from here all the way down to here. This is a span tag that's in the HTML. So if I render it again, my input to my AO element, the tag, the label is there. It went into the component, and I use that in my template to show the label. Now, 5 seconds later, I set the interval to define the click me again, and I don't know why I did that, but I figured I wanted a real label there. So notice the click count is, this is getting rendered. This is the attribute in the button component instance, and its value is 0. Okay, as I click this thing, what I do is I execute a method of the button component. Okay, so upon click, I do the handle click method, and that thing increases the counter. It defines the action, and right after I click OK, it's going to emit the event. And this particular click count will happen because I've increased the counter. This tag will change because I have an event listener on the AO button, this thing, and it's emitting the action value, and I'm going to grab it and paste it into this tag. So this was a result of the AO-button custom element emitting an event, and me having an event listener to that particular attribute. So now let's take a look at, let me just click it once more. Now the action is 2. I've increased the click counter, and both of these things happen. Notice the responsiveness is really, really nice, and like I said, it's not a complicated application, but let's take a look at changing this just slightly. So let me go back into the index.html, and let me remove this label. So now there's no input to my component. And so what happens if there's no input? I have a default value. Let's see what that default value is for the button. It is click me. So let's just get rid of this really quickly and see what happens. So the default value for the input is click me, and then click me again comes in 5 seconds later. And the action value gets emitted, and it gets placed in. I grab a handle on it. I get the span tag in the index, and I define the value to be 1, the click count to be 1, and I actually define the inner HTML to be this value. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to show you. That's the end of this tutorial, and stay tuned for more Angular Elements information coming up from Angular Orange. We will give you the content management demo. We'll give you different ways to do things. Personally speaking, I always stay at the highest level of Angular because I want to do the simplest thing to use it properly, and so that's one way to do it. And of course, the challenging thing now is, okay, how do you use it within a single page application? How do you use it for content management and projection? All these other things that Google is already experimenting with and have done successfully. And of course, beware, this does not work in Internet Explorer, and I think I tried it with Firefox. I'm having some issue too. So that's the big warning there. We have to wait until these browsers catch up to actually use this thoroughly, and you notice that if you go to Google Docs and you're in Internet Explorer, it doesn't really work that well. You have to go to Google, which I'm fine with, but that's a little bit tough for production applications.